Hey, everybody, it's Scott Leckie from Democracy Tomorrow, the World Citizen podcast. There's so many events in the world that we could cover today with our friend Matthias von Hein speaking to us from Germany, but we're going to focus on two major developments in the world. First, the famine, the official United Nations called famine in Gaza, and also recent developments in Ukraine. So moments ago, the headlines of the world's newspapers pointed to the conclusions of a UN-backed organization that says, for instance, quoting the headline in The Guardian, famine in Gaza City means deaths will increase exponentially. All of the other major news outlets in the world are mentioning man-made, generated, caused intentional famine in Gaza right now in 2025. What are your comments on that, Matthias? After all these months of conflict and war, now we know the famine's been going on for months already, but now it's official. There is a famine. People are intentionally being killed as an act of war.
Actually, I'm not surprised that the UN is now officially declaring a famine there. Various UN agencies have, as you noticed, have for months pointed out that the amount of food, the amount of water, the amount of medicine entering Gaza is substantially way, way, way below what is necessary to keep the population alive, and way more below the level to keep them healthy. So, I mean, we had, I can't even say how many UN organizations have warned already, of basically of famine, of mass death, of mass starvation. It has all been very well established. And so now the UN as a whole officially declares famine doesn't come as a surprise. What does come as a surprise is that the Israeli government can still carry on doing what it does, basically with more or less the full backing of the United States, and just, there's some protests from the Europeans, even like Germany, after many months of consideration and hesitation, has stopped sending arms to Israel. So there are some signs, but more or less, one has to, I think, establish that Israel is doing what it does without anyone, stopping it.
Yeah, complete and utter impunity, not paying attention whatsoever to the countless condemnations by all of its allies except the United States, repeatedly, and to the point whereby, by the way, this was huge news in Australia, of course, that Netanyahu personally attacked the Prime Minister of Australia repeatedly for Australia's recent change of heart to back Palestinian statehood at the upcoming meetings of the General Assembly in September in New York. Something that has never ever been at the forefront of Australian political thinking. Now, because of what's happening in Gaza, largely, the position of Australia, which has traditionally been extremely pro-Israeli, is now shifting markedly in the direction of the forces of good and the forces of peace and the forces of fairness and equity down the road. So we'll see where that goes.
And I think, now the UN is officially talking about famine, but, on a side sort of, the number of people and scholars and organizations talking about like intentional genocide in Gaza has also exploded. It's no longer considered sort of anti-Semitic, to talk about genocide in Gaza. And I mean, at the same time, as now we have an official famine in Gaza, as the Israeli government has called up 60,000 reservists to really occupy, Gaza City. At the same time, we have all these developments in the West Bank, with major construction projects on occupied country, against international law, and this time building projects that basically carve up the West Bank further in a way that, a two-state solution definitely would become, it's not an option anymore, if they go through with it. There's lots of condemnation from the European side. The sentiment has very much shifted, and now there's even in German media, which is and public media, public radio stations and so on and so forth, public broadcasters that have traditionally been super supportive of Israel. There's you have lots of experts and politicians talking about how Israel is losing its moral compass, or has lost it already. You hear interviews with experts explaining that with this hard right nationalist government, what they really aim for is the greater Israel described in the Bible, in Genesis 5, stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates River. And if you look what's happening in Lebanon and in the south of Syria, it becomes kind of credible, as unbelievable as it is. The sad thing is, unless the support of the U.S. is stopped, there will be no end to this, I think.
Yeah, where can it end? Where can it go? Our hope, of course, is that reason will finally prevail, that the, incredibly highly educated Jewish population of the world, including those who live in Israel, the half of the Jewish people that live in Israel, half do not, will exert enough pressure on the government in power today to stop the war crimes, stop the ethnic cleansing, stop the genocide, stop the enforced starvation of civilians. 83% of all the Gazans killed have been civilians. That was another point that was made today in the global media. This is a tragedy beyond description. I mean, there are no words that can describe this. There's no way to come back from this. This is something that, just as we, all of us who studied human rights and went to law school and studied about human rights law and understand the nature of the entire human rights system, all of us, in one way or another, got into it because of the Holocaust. That is what drove us to become human rights lawyers and human rights activists. So something like that would never, ever, ever happen again. And I can guarantee you that every human rights activist in the world was motivated, at least in part, by the horrors of what happened in your country and others in the region in the 1930s and 40s. I am certain, tragically, for the people of Israel and the Jewish people in the world, tragically, what human rights law students are going to study in the coming years is exactly what's taking place today. And that what has been done has been done. It will not be erased from human history. It will not be forgotten. It will be seen forever. And it will be studied as something that must never, ever happen again. Let us hope again that the people of that region can find some way to move forward. Take inspiration from the centuries of warfare in Western Europe, who finally decided they didn't want to do it anymore, and despite all odds, came together and formed a union. Different languages, different religions, different points of view, and came together imperfectly, but they did. Something has to happen in that direction, and that's certainly what we'll hope for. Now, let's move quickly to the question of the other conflict in the European sphere these days, Ukraine. There's been a whole range of developments in the recent days. There's been meetings in Washington and meetings in, where was it, Alaska, Alaska, and a whole range of other, horrible battlefield incidents and so on and so forth. So where do we go from here? What's going to happen in Ukraine? When is it going to finally end? What is it going to take to end that conflict in a fair and equitable manner? And remember, just to make the point, you know, it, countries do not give up territory, right? It's not part of the deal. You have boundaries under international law for a reason. I'm not particularly fond of boundaries, but I realize their necessity in the world in which we exist today. But the fundamental principle of international law, obviously, is do not use acts of aggression or the use of force, and certainly do not try to acquire illegally the territory of another sovereign nation state. So where do you think we can go from here, Matthias?
Well, I think, the sanctity of borders, is very much on the line, in sort of solving, quote unquote, the Ukraine conflict. Um, you know, the, you know, I mean, the dying on the battlefield still goes on, but there has now finally, I think, and there's a lot of things have started moving on the diplomatic front, which probably should have started earlier or could have started earlier, but didn't. And whether you like or don't like Donald Trump, I think, he really threw, a major rock into the water with his meeting with Vladimir Putin in Alaska. And now, the Europeans, they are, things are moving. And, let's remember, even without US support, I don't think Ukraine or even Ukraine together with Europeans could sort of hold the front. Even with US support, it is difficult enough. So I think the Ukrainians and the Europeans and the US have come to realize that it is next to impossible to win a victory on the battle lines. It's very difficult to see that. With all the support that Ukraine has got so far, there's no magic bullet in any arsenal anywhere that could change the reality on the battlefield. Especially since, Ukraine has not enough people, enough personnel to man, the front lines and the trenches. And Russia has. So Russia is betting on that advantage. It is costly for both sides, that war of attrition, but it does seem that Russia can sustain it longer. And, that's the Russian advantage.
How much longer can they? I mean, they already have over 1 million casualties. Hundreds of thousands of those are deaths, by the way. They're having to rely on troops from North Korea. They're that great, reliable ally. And the carnage goes on. And all of this, of course, is within the context of a massive demographic decline in Russia overall. So you're losing the population generally, you're losing soldiers on the battlefield, and you live in a far less than ideal democratic state. How much longer can it go on like this? I mean, obviously, Putin thinks and believes that if the war ends, he will also, his days in power are numbered. So he has an interest in continuing it, just as Netanyahu does.
I don't think so. I don't agree on that front. I totally agree that, Netanyahu needs the war to stay in power and basically to stay out of jail for corruption charges. But in my eyes, that's not the case with Putin. He doesn't sort of personally profit from the war. The thing is, I have no idea how long Russia can sustain it.
But do you think Putin would stay in power if it was clear he'd lost that war?
No, if he cannot afford to lose it, but it doesn't look as if he's losing it, and I think they however long they might sustain it, they certainly can sustain it longer than Ukraine. Russia is a land of huge resources. They even, there's no, they are not even drafting people. There's no, it's still, the war machine is fed by people who go there fighting more or less voluntarily.
Well, apparently kids from very distant outlying
Yeah,
villages in the middle of
exactly.
nowhere that
But that's
paid
I know. That's
access.
why I said more or
Well,
less voluntarily. It is their chance out of poverty. That's how they see it. Um,
including the
but
criminal.
they don't rely on force to enlist fighters. As Ukraine does. Maybe you have also seen these videos popping up in your X timeline of you know officers snatching males from the streets in Ukraine, against their will, and draft them by force to military service. There's loads of it. Anyway, the thing is, Russia can sustain it longer. There's no doubt about that. Their industry has ramped up arms production. The sort of the reservoir of people willing to fight is big enough so that they for whatever reasons people go to the army, they go to the front hoping for a better life, and a lot of them die, but they can sustain it. It's morally, you know well, I mean, I lack the words. It's super bad, but that's the way it is. Anyway, the thing is that now, there's talk about peace since Alaska. There's talk about the conditions for peace. There's talk about Ukraine giving up territory, giving up Crimea, giving up several district. Well, I don't know what it's called. Whether it's called district or sub states of Ukraine, regions, towards the east, with Russian speakers, and probably, if the fighting stops, in my eyes, it might be worth it, because the fighting cannot be sustained, and the destruction of the country is going on and on and on. And there's no, the sad fact is that there's nobody there with the capacity, the ability to stop it, from like Western side. And now there's a lot of, let me just continue. There's now lots of talk about the nitty gritty of peace, about the nitty gritty of the kind of security guarantees that Ukraine needs and wants and needs, and who is going to maybe send troops, to be stationed in Ukraine, and whether that's possible. And so there's lots and lots of discussions going on right now, and who's going to pay for it and how much. And the US has already signaled that, they won't station any, troops, any US troops within Ukraine, but they would be ready to support them, via air power and so on and so forth. So that's basically what's going on right now.
I heard that, I don't know if this is true or not, but I heard that Russia rejected the idea of any European troops even being in Ukraine. So who's going to be there? If the Yanks aren't there and the Europeans aren't there, what are we going to have? A bunch of Bangladeshi UN peacekeepers or something, or Fijian?
I have no idea. This discussion has just started. But I'm personally just glad that this discussion has begun.
Yeah, but no, I mean, no country is going to recognize sovereignty of Russia over the territories that they have conquered with force. It's fundamentally against every principle of international law, because the second you open that Pandora's box, and that's why the principle is so important, you will get these types of activities all over the place. This is exactly what the UN Charter was designed to prevent 80 years ago. Exactly these types of conflicts where territory is, you know, taken over by the use of force. It's a complete and utter prohibited act. So no one, even if there's some sort of agreement, it would never be. Not only is it contrary, obviously, to the Constitution of Ukraine to hand over territory to an aggressor, but no country is going to recognize it. And even if there's a sort of a pseudo quasi peace agreement, I've worked on many peace agreements over the years. There everything will be at an interim or ad hoc level. So there'll be this interim agreement that recognizes temporary sovereignty over Crimea and let's say the Donbass, but it won't be permanent. And the second that the regime currently in power in Moscow is no longer there, there will be a reopening of the discussion about that could be one, sort of middle way option, but there's not going to be official recognition of Russian sovereignty over those pieces of territory by anyone, as far as I can see, because they all know it doesn't play in the interest of any state anywhere to do that, because you open up the possibility that, what's to stop Russia from taking parts of China then? What's to stop India from taking all of Kashmir? What's to stop, whatever, China from taking Taiwan? What's to stop the United States taking Mexico? Or any of the small countries in the Caribbean. The list goes on and on and on. We felt a national security threat. We had to do it to save our people. That was the justification made by the United States when they invaded Grenada in 1983. Our medical students were in inherent danger of death. They weren't in danger whatsoever. They just made it up, and they took over the country, ousted the leader, killed him, took out the left-wing government, and installed their own guys. Blah, 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 blah. It's just going to open up this Pandora's box instead of putting the lid back on it, and I think that's the way, we have to go. And, it's a very difficult position, but I look at these things not purely from an ideological or even legal angle, but really from the pragmatic angle of having been involved in lots of post-conflict situations in the world. I do not envy peace negotiators right now that have to engage in this particular conflict to try to help to resolve it, because it is very difficult. And clearly, neither side is exhausted yet, because that's often one of the ways wars end. It's just exhaustion. They can't go on. The other way that wars often end is simply they run out of money. The treasure is no longer there to pay for the weapons that you need. And others is that the reputation damage done to the countries fighting is so huge that they just also consider it more advantageous to stop. And it obviously has developmental and economic and social and all these other, consequences. But, the bottom line is, for goodness sakes, humans, it's 2025, folks. We've had thousands and thousands of years to get our act together as a species and to begin to stop killing each other. And really, this is pushing us all backwards. And we need to stop and start figuring out ways to go forwards again.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, couldn't agree more. There's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way.
Well, I think this, when you see so much instability in the world, and you see so much, rising authoritarianism, you see, the decline of principles and standards, it is a time to reflect on what is possibly a better way. And that's part of the reason why we created Democracy Tomorrow in the first place, is to put a venue out there, a vehicle by which people can start considering the ideas of a new and better political system that we could organize ourselves around based on our shared humanity, the things that we all have in common with one another, and that brings us much further along the path, which I'm sure everybody at the core of their being wants, which is a peaceful world, a kinder world, a gentler world, a more fun world, a more prosperous world. And that's within our grasp. And I believe there's millions upon millions of us who look at the news, hundreds of millions, probably billions, who look at the news every single day and say, what the hell is going on? What are we doing? For goodness sakes, this has to end. And let's use the negative in the positive, like an Aikido master would. Take the negative energy and transform that negative energy into something much better, than what we have, and maybe much better, well, undoubtedly much better than anything we've ever had before. So with that, any final words, Matthias, before we head off today?
I think you wrapped it up so nicely, with a view to a golden future, better world. There's nothing more that I could add. Basically, have a nice day.
Right on. Well, I just want to reiterate again to everybody watching, there are hundreds of millions of people on this planet alive today who believe the stuff that we're talking about, who see the world as one place, who see humanity as one human family, who have friends from countries and cultures and religions of all sorts and all types across the world. It's time for all of us to come together and figure out better ways to merge our energies together and really create a viable political force throughout the world that is based upon all of these shared attributes that we have. And if we do that, and we start putting practical, real ideas on the table about how we can move things forward much further than the UN was ever able to do, and much further than any individual country can do, and we find a way forward where we can actually build a global civilization that is truly sustainable, truly prosperous for everyone, and where we let nobody fall through the cracks. We really need to just ponder that reality, and in whatever way we all can do, create it as much as we can, and hopefully the ripples will expand outwards. So
in that respect, I do have some, very short final words, and that, with that in mind, I would, ask everybody to think like globally and act locally. Don't wait, for the world government to exist and tell you what to do, but reach out in your neighborhood and do the right thing now where you can.
right. And one of the concrete things we've been doing along those lines is, and we're sort of negotiating the final text now, but it's a generic resolution that can be adopted by every single local government in the world that gives the commitment of that local government to do whatever they can locally to promote the idea in concrete terms of world citizenship for people under their jurisdiction. And that they will recognize, one of the key points it makes is if Council X adopts the resolution, then Council Y also adopts the resolution, let's say in another country, and they have mutually reciprocal obligations towards one another in terms of the contents of the resolution. So we need to come up with thousands and thousands of ways by which more and more of us can actually grab onto this idea of world citizenship. And in the end, it's really just about being kind. It's about being a good vibing person to people around you. And you will find the more good vibing you are, the more good vibes you get back. And so with that, thank you for watching. Please subscribe. I hate asking people to subscribe, but it's just part of the deal when you've got a YouTube channel. Do a like if you like it, and ring the bell if you want to do that too. So thanks everybody for watching. This has been Democracy Tomorrow, the World Citizen Podcast, and we'll see you again real soon. Thanks for watching. Thanks, Matthias. Bye.